It's becoming more and more common for gamers to really look at pro-level gaming controllers, which really is just a fancy way of saying that these controllers have features, they have options, they tend to have better joysticks, triggers, and just generally tend to be better controllers than what you'd expect from a pack-in controller with your new gaming console. And on the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2, you have a ton of options. You have so many different brands and manufacturers when it comes to pro gaming controllers. But one of the things that the Switch 2 and the Switch do very well is they have a great back catalog of classic games. And a lot of gamers are rediscovering Super Nintendo, N64, GameCube on this console, and they want something that feels a little bit more classic, but also want to have the ability to use a higher quality controller than just the pack-in Joy-Cons that come with the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2. And recently, a company called 8bitDo reached out to me and offered me the opportunity to test out their Pro Controller 3. And this controller is unique in the way that it offers a lot of the features of a classic controller in terms of its layout, but it also offers a lot of flexibility, customization, and quality joysticks that you'd expect from a pro-level gaming controller. Kind of meeting right in the middle of what maybe a lot of Nintendo Switch and Switch 2 gamers would be looking for in a good controller. However, with that being said, some gamers may find some deficiencies with this and may not like the layout or may not like some of the features that this offers versus what else is out on the market, or even versus Nintendo's official Pro Controller 2 with the Switch 2. And in this video, I'm going to go over who this controller is ultimately for, some of the things it does really, really well, and some of the things that may turn off some gamers who are looking at swapping out their pack-in Joy-Cons with something a little bit more durable. So let's take a look. So to start, it's clear that 8bitDo with their Pro 3 controller is trying to really push a level of nostalgia with these controllers. And what I mean is a lot of the colors that they offer, so they offer 4 standard colors, but these colors all harken back to different eras of Nintendo, from Super Nintendo to the Nintendo GameCube, for example. And what I mean is I got the purple indigo controller from 8bitDo, and this looks very similar to the color palette of an original GameCube controller, which I thought was a nice touch, especially for where this controller sits in terms of being modern, but also having a level of Nintendo feel to it. So I thought this was pretty cool in terms of their color selections that they have for these controllers. Now, unboxing this controller and unboxing this packaging, this feels pretty premium. So what I mean is this feels like the care went into properly packaging and making sure that this controller didn't bounce around or, you know, get damaged in shipping. And I know that might seem like a minor thing, but if you followed my controller reviews on this channel, I've had some brands literally just put a bit of plastic wrap on the thing, throw it in a box, and the thing gets beat up before it even shows up at your house. So it's clear that 8bitDo is really trying to give gamers a premium experience overall with this controller. In the box, what you get is the controller itself, you get a dock for the controller, you also get a cable to plug the controller into either a Nintendo Switch, a Switch 2, or a PC. And you also get a compartment underneath the actual dock itself that has different buttons that you can swap out on the front of this controller, as well as the joysticks. And I'll kind of get into that in a moment as well. But out of the gate, you get quite a few different features with this device, which is pretty cool, and it really adds value and credibility to this being a, you know, not just a standard controller, but a pro style controller itself, in the way that you have customization and you have options for these controllers. Now, getting into the actual setup, for the Switch 2, this really was just as simple as plugging it into my Switch dock and letting it charge for a sec, and then the controller was good to go essentially. And my Switch 2 recognized it immediately. Now, I have read online from some people that this controller can wake up the Switch. I know for some people this is a huge deal. I play at my computer desk, so for me, I can just turn the Switch 2 on. It's no big deal to me. Some people, though, this is a big point of contention when it comes to picking the Pro 2 controller versus any of the alternatives that are on the market. But for me, it really is just a simple matter of turning my Switch 2 on and I'm good to go. So apparently there is a way to set this up that you can actually set this up to turn the Switch on. I don't know how. I haven't figured out how to do that yet. Now, getting into the controller itself, you can see that the face itself, the joysticks are kind of more in a PlayStation setup where they're right in the center, and then you have your D-pad and then you have your standard buttons. Now, my understanding is the reason for this is if you're playing like a Super Nintendo game or any just classic general games, this controller gives more of that feel than a standard gaming Switch 2 controller would give you. What I mean is, you look at the Switch 2 Pro controller, you have the joystick similar to an Xbox layout, versus this being almost looking like a Super Nintendo layout with two joysticks added in the center. Now, this will be one of those things that if you're looking at purchasing one of these controllers, one of the first decisions that I would say you'd have to make. Me personally, I'm comfortable playing games like this. I don't mind the Xbox layout or the PlayStation layout. Personally, I could care less. For some gamers, this is a big deal. They don't like having them in the center, or they don't like having the joystick and the Xbox orientation. That's to each their own, but for me, I personally like the fact that I can use this more in line with like a Super Nintendo controller and switch into a more modern PlayStation style controller. I like that flexibility, but some people might not like that. Now, getting into the actual buttons, and this is where I really think that you as a consumer are gonna really have to decide, is this really what I want out of my device, or do I want something more Nintendo-esque? And here's what I mean. These buttons feel a lot more like a retro gaming controller. They feel a little, I would say in some ways, a little stiffer, which for me isn't necessarily a bad thing. The D-pad itself is a bit more modernized and it's clicky when you press it, and I will say I prefer this D-pad over the Pro Controller 2 from Nintendo. But the buttons themselves, I actually kind of like Nintendo's buttons more on their Pro 2 controller than this Pro 3 controller from 8bitDo. And what I mean by that is the Nintendo's version of their Pro controller, those buttons, they just feel almost a little squishy, but in the right ways. They're squishy, but they're tactile enough that they press down in a way that feels meatier, I guess is the best way to put it. Whereas these buttons do feel more like a classic Nintendo controller. And again, some people may prefer this. Some people may prefer that type of button layout, but for me personally, I'm not as big of a fan of the actual face buttons as I am on my Nintendo Switch Pro controller. Now, getting into the triggers, you'll notice on the top, so you have all the standard L1, R1 buttons. You have also added to the top, you have your L4 and R4 buttons, and these are just additional buttons that you can map. You also, on the back side, have two paddle buttons as well. So you would ultimately have 4 different customization pieces in terms of button mapping. I will say that I personally did not care for the layout of the L4 and the R4 on this controller. I felt like it was a little weird trying to push my hands towards it. I would have preferred if we just had 4 back paddles similar to like an Xbox Elite controller. It's a minor thing, but for me, I didn't necessarily care about the placement. The paddles themselves, though, I thought they worked very well. I thought they actually felt very good. The placement felt perfect, and I didn't feel like I was, resting into the controller and accidentally pressing them. I thought that they worked ultimately well. They felt good, and they were nicely designed and tightly designed in a way that made sense for me. You'll also notice on the front, you have this little star button, which acts as both your capture button as well as essentially a button to help you map your buttons. So what I mean by that is, if you hold down your back paddle or one of the L4, R4 buttons, and you press another button on the controller like A, or you're indenting in, or up on the D-pad or whatever it is, and then you press this star button, you'll see that this starts to, this is how you know it's mapped essentially, because this ring starts to glow. So you have different mapping options when it comes to that. And you can also just easily reset it by going through that same process again and over again. One of the things that this seems to be common with Switch generally is we don't really have any front-facing software from any of these manufacturers. I believe 8bitDo has some very good software for the PC. I cannot tell you that I've actually tested it, but as I understand, there is some good quality customization software. But if you're using this on a Switch or Switch 2, you won't get that same experience. You'll have to use the manual button mapping with that star button like you have on this controller here, which for me is not a major issue, but for some people, it may be something that they're a little turned off by. And just so we're also clear, the Switch 2's software that interacts with the Pro 2 controller from Nintendo does not work with the 8bitDo, so you don't really have that option either for customization. Now, getting into the joysticks, and this is something that I tend to talk about quite a bit when it comes to any controller that's not official from you know, Xbox or Nintendo. I always like to test the joysticks and see how the dead zones work, because some people may be purchasing this controller for shooting games, for example. So I tested this with Star Wars Outlaws, and I put a little bit of playtime into it actually, and using these joysticks, they felt really good. I'm not too deep into the technology, but these are TMR joysticks, which as I understand use like magnetic technology to be more precise and efficient. And one of the biggest things I always look for is the actual dead zones. So does this feel like you're way out of whack when it comes to aiming or not? And this controller, the dead zones feel really good and the joysticks feel very smooth. Now, I would say they don't feel as smooth as the official Nintendo Pro Controller 2 does, but they feel smooth and they feel good. And I would say they're comparable, and they're, if I were to put this into more of a metric, maybe these are like a 1 point step down versus the Switch 2s in terms of how they feel. But overall, they feel good, they feel durable. You also have the option with these joysticks to change them out for different joysticks, or in this case, almost like arcade ball tops. Seems kind of like a gimmick. I personally would have preferred different heighted joysticks, smaller and higher, like you kind of get with, you know, your Xbox Elite controllers or some of the alternative brands that are on the market. But they put this in here to kind of, again, appeal to people who want the retro flexibility with this controller, as well as pro-level gaming features. It's not a major knock, just a consideration. You also have the option to change out the face buttons on this. So you can change them out to look more in line with a super retro controller, or you can keep them like I kept them, just stock and kind of matching the GameCube color palette that this controller represents essentially. Again, features that I appreciate. I'm not gonna say they necessarily make a huge difference though to me, but some people this might be the end all be all with this type of controller. The D-pad itself though cannot be swapped out, can't be changed, but I will argue this D-pad feels really good. And I used it in long play sessions for Street Fighter 6, and I felt like this controller felt very good, very responsive, and I preferred playing with the D-pad on this versus my Switch 2 controller or Switch 2 Pro controller that oftentimes I was reverting to the joystick for games like Street Fighter because I didn't like the way the D-pad felt in comparison. So overall, when you look at those features in terms of the face buttons, how they feel, you look at the joysticks, how they feel, I would say you have a pretty good package. However, a lot of this is going to come down to preference, and I will argue it like this. This controller so far, in comparison to the Switch 2 controller, generally is pretty like a lot of the features are very similar, it's just they're different in certain ways, and I wouldn't say any of the differences are necessarily bad, they're just more based off of preference. Now, getting into the actual battery life of this controller, I basically had this controller being used non-stop over the past handful of days, and I would argue that the battery life feels comparable to the Switch 2 Pro controller. So again, this controller really is making a case not off of if it's a better or worse controller than what else is out on the market, because everything it's doing so far is great, but it's really just preference, because again, battery life is 1-to-1 essentially. Now, there is one feature though that this controller does lack entirely versus what else is out there, and here's what I'm getting at. The Switch 2 Pro controller has a headphone jack. Some of the cheaper Pro controllers I've had on my Switch have headphone jacks. This controller, oddly enough, is completely lacking that. And I'm not sure why that wasn't included, especially because this is taking a Pro namesake, and it's not uncommon that some people are going to use headphones. I myself sometimes game using headphones. So it's kind of bizarre that this controller did not include a headphone jack. Might not be a major issue for some people, but for me, I would say that is a notable knock on this controller. And I understand some people are using Bluetooth headsets and that sort of thing, but for my Switch and Switch 2, I only really have wired headsets, so it's unfortunate that this doesn't have that feature. And lastly, I didn't really go into this too deeply, but I just want to highlight it. You do have hair trigger features on this controller. The downside is the Switch 2 doesn't really recognize, the depth of the press on your triggers. So ultimately, it's kind of something that, to me, if you're using this for your Switch or Switch 2, it's kind of irrelevant. However, if you're using this controller for PC gaming, you have the option to do this, and it might be worthwhile. But I'm reviewing this, and I've only reviewed this on the context of my Switch 2. So just something to consider. And again, it's not a major knock at the controller. It's just something to consider. Like, it seems almost a little irrelevant for the Switch 2. But hey, maybe you like the actual tactile feeling of pressing these down versus, just having it click when you put it to the lowest setting on the hair triggers. It's really up to you. Now, my ultimate verdict is this is a very good controller. This controller features a lot of things that the official Nintendo controller doesn't feature, like swappable joysticks, 4 mappable buttons versus 2, as well as it also has swappable buttons, and you can change those things out. Otherwise, everything in comparison to a Switch 2 Pro controller, it really comes down to preference. And so what I mean is, they both do a lot of really good things. And I know a lot of this video is comparing those two together, but these are kind of the most common choices people are going to make when it comes to shopping for their dedicated Pro controller. But it really comes down to preference. I like this type of controller for fighting games like Street Fighter 6. I also like using this type of controller for some of the Nintendo classic games that I might play on this, like the Super Nintendo games, because I like the orientation and I like the nostalgia of playing with something that feels a little more like a Super Nintendo controller than using a more modernized Nintendo controller. And so I like that, and I like the fact that I can also, use this like a modern controller, and it feels comfortable using it as a modern controller. However, some people may not like the orientation of the joysticks, and they may not care about using this for Nintendo classic games, and that's completely fine. And in that case, you might find this controller is a little more lackluster and not really going to suit your needs for what you want out of a gaming controller. But ultimately, this controller is about $40 Canadian cheaper than the official Nintendo controller. And if you're looking at getting a good pro level gaming controller without spending over $100 Canadian, I would say this controller checks all the boxes in terms of quality joysticks, quality buttons, with a couple quirks that unfortunately you may have to get over if price is your main reason for going for this. But in terms of usability, in terms of how this feels, in terms of the quality and the weighting of this, I think this is a great controller. And if you're looking at getting something to play all your classic games as well as new games, I don't think you can go wrong with this controller.